This slideshow will focus and lecture will focus on the Western pioneers, the first people to move out west of the Appalachian Mountains, and kind of just the growth of that area. So the country was expanding at this point. The population was getting really big, and they needed to find a place to live. And so a lot of the people started to move west of the Appalachian Mountains. The population up there was growing really rapidly during the times that we've already been talking about. So if we start in 1800, back then, beginning of the country, there's about 387,000 white settlers who are living out in that area. By 1820, there's 2.5 million or more white settlers out there, and it's continuing to grow and grow and grow and grow. By the time the Civil War happens, we're going to see ourselves with more people living out west of the Appalachian Mountains than there are living on the Atlantic coast, where most of the people have been living for most of America's history at this point. John Lewis O'Sullivan, he was a magazine editor, and he wrote an article and really kind of coined this really important term that we've used. And he said that it was our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by providence. So what is manifest destiny? What does that mean? It's this idea that God, providence is another word for God. Okay, idea that God provided this whole continent of North America for the Americans and wanted them to settle it. So it was this idea that it was right and just thing to do to go in, kick out the heathens, the Native Americans who were not Christian, and take over this continent that was given to us by God. And so kind of an interesting look at it, but we'll see what that kind of led to. Farming at this time is one of the reasons that people were moving out to the west. They wanted land, they wanted their own farm so that they could make their own money and not just work for somebody else. Another reason was for religious reasons. We'll look at that later on in this lecture. But first off, the farming, the squatters is kind of how people were getting this land. And a squatter is just one of these early pioneers that came out and settled on land that they didn't own. So they sat down, built their house, had a farm, all this stuff on land that was unoccupied, that they didn't own, that nobody owned. And so they had this big piece of land, nobody owned it, but they were farming it. The government wanted to come out and survey the land that they owned and sell the land to different companies, and then those companies would sell it out. So they'd have these nice square parcels that people could buy, whatever. Squatters, however, the American people, wanted to buy it from the government. They wanted the opportunity to own the land that they've already been on and already been farming and already made fences and whatever else. And so, bowing to that pressure, the government created the Preemption Act of 1830. And the Preemption Act of 1830 simply says, we're going to come in and we are going to survey the land, sell it to those companies, we're going to do all this stuff, but squatters have the right to first claim the land and buy it up to 160 acres at a very cheap price of $1.25 per acre at that time. And so that's what ended up happening is those squatters were able to buy that land for a very low amount of money. So out there's a lot of grass cover. There's a lot of roots that need to be broken up to farm. So there's this thing called sod. And if you've ever taken a shovel and really dug into something, dug a hole in the ground, you know that first scoop or two is really difficult because the grass roots go down and kind of just make this tangled web that's really hard to cut through. You almost have to cut through it instead of digging it up. And so this was difficult out there, and you needed to break through that to be able to plant seeds and farm and get rid of all that grass stuff. And so new inventions started to come through that helped farmers be more productive. In 1819, Jethro Wood invented a plow. There already was a plow before, but it had a wooden blade, so it broke up the earth with wood, but that wasn't working. It was breaking all the time, and so he created an iron bladed plow in 1819, and then with that rusting and all that kind of stuff, John Deere invented a steel bladed plow, 1837. So Yeah, John Deere invented that. And then, so obviously that'd be stronger, wouldn't rust, all that kind of stuff. Cyrus McCormick also invented a very important piece of technology, the mechanical reaper. Before this, you cut down the grain, you would knock it down, cut it down by hand, and then shake it out. Now, you can see this machine here in the picture. It would be run by horses and pulled by horses or pushed by horses, and it would cut the the rows of grain down, and so they'd be cut down. All you'd have to do is pick them up, and this machine could do it much faster than you could just go out with a blade and cut it yourself. So people were not just settling the Great Plains, but they were also settling the Pacific coast all the way on the other side of the continent. And what was happening here is the Oregon country, which the Oregon country included what today is Oregon, Washington, British Columbia up in Canada. All right. In 1818, both Britain and America decided that they would occupy the land together. So they would decide later who it belonged to, but they would just, live in it together, and that would be just fine. Both have power, all that kind of stuff. And then American missionaries started to come in the 1830s in order to convert the natives to Christianity. So to take them away from their religions, their beliefs, and turn them into Christians. And so they started to come back, and when they'd visit back west and send letters and things like that, they would spread the word about this amazing land in the Willamette Valley. And they convinced a lot of other people to start coming over there. But the difficult part was, how do we get there? How do we get over these mountains, through these woods, through all this difficult stuff? Well, the answer to that was the mountain men. Okay, here's an example of a mountain man. A mountain man, a man is just a person who lived in this really, really difficult place. So they lived in this harsh environment on the mountains, in the West. There's no towns, nothing like that. And what they did is they trapped animals and traded their furs to people on the West Coast to make money, okay? And to feed themselves and all that kind of stuff. And they really got to know the natives really well. They got to know the land very well. They were just kind of living out in the mountains on their own. And so by the 1840s, these men had carved out trails for themselves to use, right? But they also carved out these trails to help people travel from east to west, right? So from the East Coast all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. And the most famous of these trails was the Oregon Trail, but the California Trail was also big, the Santa Fe Trail, the Mormon Trail, which we'll learn about later on. But all of these trails were cut out by these mountain men, and they used that as another piece of income, as you'll see in a little bit, as they were the guides who got the settlers through these trails. Take a moment to write out the checkpoint answer to this question. All right, so the way that these settlers moved west was in something called wagon trains, and what that was it was a train of Conestoga wagons. Okay, so these were covered, so that would keep you safe from the elements, from animals, from native attacks possibly. And if you spent a whole bunch of or if you had a whole bunch of people together, you could keep each other safe as well, safety in numbers. And so they moved in these covered wagons all together, and usually to get across something like the Oregon Trail, this red trail up here on this map, it would take about 6 months. You could go about 15 miles per day on this old rusted or bad trail, that was all muddy and whatever. Who knew what kind of conditions as you're going over the mountains and all that kind of stuff. All right. And so as you're moving, you not only have to move 15 miles per day, but you got to keep yourself alive. And so for 6 whole months. And so the men, they hunted for animals, drove the carts, hunted for animals, cared for the oxen and the animals that they had brought with. They did all of these things. And the women mostly cared for the kids. They cooked at the camp and fed everybody. And then they cleaned, the different, do dishes, do the laundry, all that kind of stuff that needed to be done. And so It was really an exhausting and difficult thing. They're stuck, going through snow, mud, water to their knees. It's just a terrible road. And, you got your babies with you, and it's just really, really difficult. And so that was what was happening. And at the beginning, these mountain men were helping them and guiding them across, but eventually guidebooks were created and people just were doing it on their own. They were just using the guidebooks as guides, and those people were known as overlanders. So Native Americans definitely came into play here too. They lived in this Great Plains area, and there was a lot of fear from these settlers of attacks by the natives. But it was kind of unfounded fear. It did not happen very often that they were attacked. From 1840 to 1860, in that 20-year span, only 362 white settlers died from Native American attacks. In the same amount of time, white settlers killed 462 natives. So it was actually the white settlers that were doing much more damage and should be feared a lot more than the natives at this point. The natives were mainly helpful to the settlers as they gave them food and resources, gave information about land and routes. They'd talk to them and try and get information if they could, and they'd help them out. And then they also traded with each other to refresh the goods. So if you had brought too much of one thing and didn't have enough food, you could trade with those natives for the food. You could trade that extra of your stuff for the food. And so that was really beneficial to the settlers who, again, had to carry 6 months worth of food with them, which would be very difficult. And if all of a sudden your wagon wheel breaks or something and you got to stop for a day or two to fix it, that could be a big problem and really slow you down. You wouldn't have enough food. So most of them were helpful. And so the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho in particular really got nervous when all these people started to come through, because as they were coming through, they were messing with the buffalo. So the buffalo were coming through, they were hunting the buffalo. Lots of people were and killing them. And then they were also just in the way of the buffalo's normal migration as they moved through this area like they always had. And so they were really afraid that it was going to change their way of life, because they depended on the buffalo for food, for shelter, for tools, for everything. They used every part of the buffalo. And so that made them very, very nervous. And they were afraid of that. But the federal government really wanted to keep the peace as much as they could with these natives, and so they created the Treaty of Fort Laramie, which was signed in 1851 by many, many different native tribes, and also the American government. And basically what they said is that we promise that you get the Great Plains as long as you let us pass through peacefully without attacks and stuff like that. So if you let our settlers go through there and not be attacked, we will allow you to keep that land, and we won't come in and try and take it from you. And so they also paid small payments to the native tribes as they were moving through. So through the years, every year, they would make payments to these tribes, and that was part of the treaty as well. The last group of people we're going to talk about that also went west was the Mormons. And the Mormon is a religion, okay? And so at this point, it was a fairly new religion. It was founded by Joseph Smith. And so the Mormons, like many Americans had done all the way through history, they had to move for their religious freedom. So they had to get out of the eastern states because they were being persecuted there. They had to leave because in 1844, a mob came through and murdered their leader for what he was saying against Christianity, right? Because he didn't believe in Christianity, he believed in this Mormon faith, okay? And so in 1844, like I said, he got murdered, and then Brigham Young became the leader of the Mormon church and started to bring his people to the west to escape this persecution. And so several thousand of these people moved all along the Mormon trail, and they're moving along this trail and looking for a place to settle. And in 1847, so 3 years later, after this mob had murdered their leader, and about a year into their journey, the Mormons stopped and settled in a place at the Great Salt Lake. They came across this lake and they settled there in Utah. And even though it was really a difficult place to live, and how wild it was, they claimed the land and they built it up. And Salt Lake City is still a very large city today. And it was kind of founded by these Mormon people who were moving to have their own religious freedom. Take some time to write out 3 questions that you have from the notes so far. If you have no questions, then just create 3 test questions you might see on a quiz or a test.